We're going to use this as a ballot review exercise. I'm going to do this as kind of a live recording, both to keep myself focused and hopefully entertained. So in the HL7 ballot desktop, which, by the way, if you don't know where to find it, the way to find it is to do a web search for HL7 ballot desktop, and that'll take you to the website. However, if you have not signed in and signed up for the ballot process ahead of time, then you will not see a list of any ballot consensus groups that you are participating in. I signed up for several of them, however, last month, and so there's a bunch that I can review today. The idea is that each row in this table represents a different specification that is currently undergoing ballot, which means it's a kind of a draft specification that is going through this process of community review. And I basically signed up as a reviewer for all the ballots that mentioned FHIR or CDS hooks as sort of my areas of interest within HL7, and we can see that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 of these in the table. So I was thinking it would be kind of a nice idea to just sort of randomly pick one and then work through a little bit of the ballot review process in this kind of recording, just live. So I'm going to pick one that I really don't know anything about here. I'm going to go with the third one in the list here, which is the Implementation Guide, Data Exchange for Quality Measures, Release 1, US Realm. So that tells us a little bit about where it's intended to be used. And then what I won't be going through in this recording is filling out an official ballot comment form. But there's a couple of ways that you can provide feedback. They all sort of boil down to a spreadsheet where you provide your feedback row by row. But for the purposes of this session, I'll be taking notes for myself here in this text doc, and eventually we'll migrate these into some official reporting format. So let's get started. This is the DaVinci HL7 Data Exchange for Quality Measures STU3 for FHIR R4. So that means that this is sort of the third release of this guide, which is based on the fourth release of the FHIR specification. And there's a note here to balloters that says, only the new content for gaps in care is in scope for ballot in this cycle. So this is sort of an interesting technical detail. They must have gotten feedback on this particular area of the spec the last time around, and they don't want feedback on anything else. They're considering only this new content to be in scope. I haven't read this guide before, so I don't know if I'll be able to understand the new content in isolation, but let's see if I can focus on that, because it sounds like any other feedback I have won't necessarily be taken into account. So new content, I guess they're going to have these sort of highlighted boxes that'll show me where all the new content is. And on this page, there's really only a few. So I'll just use search here to find those boxes. Unfortunately, this is not text, so I can't search for the text new content. It sure does look like text. What is going on here? This is indeed text, but it's not page text. It's inserted using this CSS selector : before. Okay, so that's a little unfortunate. Let's see. Gaps in care reporting gives guidance on interactions between clients and server to exchange the gaps in care reports, or maybe the gaps in care reports for a measure. Clients and servers are defined in, this is not a link, section 1.7.3. Gaps in care reporting scenarios. Okay, and then there's this link here, which is also called gaps in care. This is gaps in care reporting. This is gaps in care. There's new content here under terminology and operations. Now there is a lot here that I did not look at in the last ballot round. And now there's new content here, gaps in care reporting scenarios. This looks simple enough. We've got a client that calls the gaps in care operation on a server, and the server responds with gaps in care bundles. So gaps in care reporting is added as a new group of reporting scenarios. Similar to reporting scenarios, a gaps in care report is used to report the results of quality measures on patients or populations but for a gaps through period that is of interest for a client. So gaps through period sounds like some kind of a technical term. It is not one that I know. Ha! Look at that, a glossary. How fabulous! It'd be even better if that term was linked down to the glossary, but this is great. Gaps through period. I'm just going to write a note there. And so the example that I had here that I wanted to search for was gaps through period. Okay, so through period is a period of time defined by a client for running the gaps in care report. When the end period date of the gaps is specified as a future date, that means the gaps will be run prospectively, which provides opportunities for actions to be taken to close the gaps. When the end period is a past date, it indicates the gaps in care report will be run retrospectively. Okay, so closed gap means no discrepancies exist. Gaps in care are discrepancies between recommended best practices and services actually provided. An open gap is a discrepancy that isn't closed, I guess. Okay, it's just open gaps seem like gaps. And then a positive measure and an inverse measure. Positive measure means that a higher performance rate is better. An inverse measure means that a lower performance is better. Okay, so let's go back to this diagram. So you say something about the period, presumably as an input to this operation, although the period is being shown as this arrow above. Clients submit the gaps in care results of quality measures. Clients may be different stakeholders. For example, if a provider requests a report from a payer system, then the provider serves as the client. Okay? Servers are the actors receiving the request for gaps in care report and producing it based on information they have in their system. Again, depending on the requirements, the receivers could be different stakeholders. For example, a provider requesting a report from the payer can be a server, request a report, or a payer could request a report from their own system. Okay. All right, so we've sort of briefly reviewed all the new boxes on this page. Now we can move into the detailed addition of new content, gaps in care reporting. So there's a fair amount here. Let's read through it. So gap in care, just like the glossary tells us, it's a discrepancy between recommended practices and provision services. They can adversely affect people, they can be expensive, and it's important for people to know about them. Okay? We need to have information about gaps in care, and sometimes there's just incomplete healthcare information. So if there's a gap in care information, that means disparities between claims and clinical data that make it difficult to assess if best practices are being followed. Okay, so it might look like there's a gap simply because you don't have enough data, or there might not be data because actually care was not provided. If you don't see a record, it's hard to tell which situation you're in, but we know that care gaps are supposed to matter, resolving them is important, and performing gaps in care, I think this means performing an analysis of gaps in care. So I'm just going to put a note here. They want to say perform an assessment of gaps. All right, gaps can be caused by several potential reasons. Well, the background here is not necessarily helping me that much. I mean, it's sort of a treatise on things that are broken about our healthcare system. Most straightforward reason is care hasn't yet been provided. Hasn't yet, meaning it's going to be provided later. While providers can't always control closing the gaps, most scenarios can be easily remedied. Is that true? Okay. Incomplete healthcare information. This is, I guess, just a definition of this term here. I think the firm was trying to say something like there could be gaps because care wasn't provided or because no data was available about the care that was provided. That's a lot of words to not really quite get that message across. Okay, an organization or tool collecting data may have updated information on the care in which the provider may not be aware of. Wow, this really has not been copy edited. Okay. For example, a payer might have paid a claim for a self-ordered mammogram, and the provider may not be aware the test was completed. Using gaps in care reporting, that allows the payer to share. It allows. I don't know what this it is. I think that it is extraneous. The payer to share information with the provider managing the patient's care and provides an opportunity to help address. Oh, goodness. Alternatively, a provider may have data that the payer may not know about. Okay. Intro is sprawling and should be tightened up. Less clinical context. More focused on the problem to be solved here. All right. Quality improvement ecosystem. This image really isn't showing anything. So what is this showing? There's a population here. There's this stethoscope laptop, clinician and patient workflow. This thing is requesting a report from this thing, and it's providing something back. These arrows are not clear. The down arrow and the left arrow, what do they mean? It's just doesn't really say anything. Okay. Gaps in care reporting is built on individual reporting, which is where a new gaps in care individual measure report profile is created. So this is new content, and this is now getting into some FHIR profiling. So we'll take a good close look at that. And that's based on some underlying individual measure report, but we're not going to look at that because it's not in scope for this ballot. Okay, that allows the gaps of care reporting to use the same machinery as individual reporting. Sounds like a good reuse of reporting. Default profiles. So we've got 5 profiles. There's a gaps in care bundle, a gaps in care composition, there's detected issues, groups, and individual measure reports. All right, so we'll just open those up because we'll take a look at those as well. And are those all different from what I opened in the front? Individual measure report, bundle. The individual measure report was one that I already opened. Yeah, those guys are the same. Okay. All right, what else do we have here in the intro? This is going to show us the relationship between these GIC resources, or GIC profiles, which is how I'm going to say gaps in care now. All right, so GIC compositions seem like, well, maybe measure reports are sort of at the center of the world. They have, can't quite tell which way these arrows are going. Okay, this is a white box that's sort of occluding little bits of these 4 different lines. That should be a transparent background. Okay. So the composition is sort of at the center here. It's wrapped in a bundle. All right, the bundle actually has a couple of things. It has the composition, it has some measure reports in it. So I guess this is an example because it has things like pneumococcal flu vaccine, open gap, or breast cancer screening, closed gap. I guess, what is the implication of a closed gap? Is that just care that was provided, or does it mean that it was withheld for a certain amount of time until a gap developed? Closed gap. How is a closed gap different from standard of care being practiced? Okay. So we got these bundles, compositions, measure reports. And the measure report itself is somehow representing a gap, which is either open or closed. And then these are generated on the basis of some FHIR resources like procedures and observations. So because these procedures and observations were recorded in the system, I was able to generate a measure report. I wrap those reports in an overall composition. There might be some detected issues as well. And the QI core patient is also pointed to by all these geeky things. Okay, gaps through period is the time. So I say now we're getting into a reporting operation. So this is the $ care gaps operation. And it looks like we can pass in the beginning and end of a period as dates. And we can pass in a reference of some kind and a measure. So let's see if we can find this operation definition, just going back. We probably have it open from that original list. Operations, this is the new operation here, care gaps. It's intended to replace the existing care gaps operation, okay? I didn't know about that one anyway. The operation shall provide at least a start, an end, and subject or practitioner or organization. What does it mean, the operation shall provide? Does it mean the client invoking the operation? Not totally clear. Caller of the operation needs to provide? I'm guessing that's what it means to say. Hopefully that's gonna, I see it can appear in these constraints because there's no place to express a co-occurrence constraint on a FHIR operation definition. Fine. So we've got a period start, which is a date. We've got a period end, which is a date. We've got a subject, which is a reference represented as a string. And we've got a practitioner, which presumably is also a reference represented as a string. I wonder why those are different. So this is for this operation. Presumably the patient and the practitioner and the org are all references. Only the subject actually says it's a reference. Okay. So overall, this seems pretty good. You give it a period, more or less, decomposed into two date strings. Incidentally, FHIR has a period data type, but you can't use it as an input to an operation like this one if you want to call it via HTTP GET, because it's called a complex parameter. You can only pass simple parameters like strings and numbers and dates and codes in as query params. So that's why it's been sort of reified into these two different properties. All right, you can optionally tell it a bunch of topics, measures a category of the measures of interest for this GAPS report. So you can say, I'm interested in chronic disease measures or HEDIS measures, those kinds of things. The topic can be individual codes, or the topic can also be a value set. And it's bound to, it's bound as an example to this definition topic. Treatment, education, assessment. Okay. So it's a string that can refer to, well, how does it work? How does it point to a value set or a specific, what's it called, concept within a value set? So for example, if I pass in a string like, I don't know what it's supposed to look like. How do you parse it unambiguously, I guess is the question. They're all strings, but you gotta know how to treat them. And in general, a code in FHIR can look like a URL. I don't think there's any prohibition against that. In other words, what I mean is, I look at the FHIR data types and I look at the string data type here, sorry, the code data type is what I wanted to zoom in on. Where did that go? There it is. The code is basically just, can't start with a space. And then beyond that, it's got to have some non-empty stuff. So there's no reason a URL couldn't appear in a code. Okay, that's kind of a weird one, but it suggests that maybe there's some custom processing invoked here, rather than kind of standard FHIR operation semantics. Interestingly, the fact that these are all strings, I wonder whether this is sort of a common practice. So if we look at existing operations in FHIR, let's just see in the operations framework, what's one that would probably take in patient? Well, it's So this would be more typical, would be to accept a code, or perhaps a coding if there's any representation for those things. But I want to find one that has a resource reference in it. Okay, value set expansion lets you expand a value set by telling it which resource to expand. But here you pass it in using a canonical reference. Or you can pass in a value set. And I guess that means you pass it in directly using the dot resource. That's not a reference to a value set, it's actually a value set. And that could only be invoked by a post. Okay, we won't go any farther down that rabbit hole for now. What else? We got statuses that needs to be drawn from this value set here. Open gaps and closed gaps. And what is a closed gap? Maybe this will tell us. Well, no, this is really the code for what status is to include. It's not the definition of a closed gap. Fine. And then again, for measures, we've got this sort of string-based reference. What is the expected format? Relative URI? Canonical? Absolute URL? Identifier? Just says the measures. You just have to know. And maybe there's some examples here of what it looks like to invoke the operation, which would probably give us a better sense of what's really what they have in mind here. So let's see if we can find parameters being passed into a care gaps. These are a little cryptically shorthand here. MRP. I don't know what MRP is. This one says gaps, though. Let's take a look at this as a JSON parameters resource. So this is the output. And this is funny because if we look at the operation definition here, there's only one parameter and it's called return. And what FHIR says in general is that when you only have one parameter and it's called return, there's some special behavior. If there's a single output parameter named return, the response may be the resource that is the return value with no parameters. Okay, but the server gets to decide. If there's only one output parameter, which is a resource with the parameter name return, then the parameter format is not used and the response is simply the resource itself. So there is a contradiction. And here we go down the rabbit hole of issue reporting. So this is an active FHIR core issue. So we can report that on the FHIR JIRA. What have we got here? So in this section here, it's one of the issues. So basically the issue is it's unclear whether it needs to be a bare resource. So let's just look. In this response section here, it's pretty clear that, and I'll add some emphasis here, the resource is simply. And then the other place that we saw this is, it wasn't in quotes. And this is where we saw the may. And that was a little higher up the page in the executing section. Now, I have to say this is related to a specific page in the FHIR spec called operations. Which I can't find because I haven't said yet that I want to be in the FHIR spec. And now I can say operations. And then I thought I had typed in a summary, but apparently not. So assuming that that is fair game, then this example we were looking at of a return value, these are the gaps in care that have been detected. What I really wanted to see was the request value before we got into this return value. But I guess they haven't captured it in parameters because they're assuming it's all going to be issued via GET, I suppose. All right, and we were going to look at this JSON. So this is the result. It's a bundle. It's got a profile tag on it. It's got an identifier. And now, okay, we've got the composition inside, which is sort of the overall framework holding this gaps in care report. It's of type gaps in care report. It's got a patient as a subject. It's issued on a date by a certain author. And then it's got, in this case, 2 sections. One about colorectal cancer screening and one about cervical cancer screening. Okay. And then each section has a focus as well as some entries. And the focus is the measure report, and the entries are detected issues. All right. So, for example, this measure report on, which one is this? It's either going to be the colorectal or the cervical cancer, I'm guessing. Having trouble spotting which one it is. I could read through the narrative, but that's going to give me a headache. Now it's a proportional measure. Something about a certification identifier. I wonder what that is. There's a reporting vendor. Defines the period. Improvement notation. So this is telling us there's been an increase in this measure. Now there's 1 person in the population right now, and 0 out of that 1 person counts, and no one has been excluded, which gives us a score of 0. And the evaluated resource was an encounter. I wonder what this extension is about. Population reference. I guess maybe this contributed to the initial population. That's why the extension is there to tell us that. So we looked at the encounter, and we looked at the patient. Okay, that told us this person didn't something. What didn't they? I was really expecting to find like a code to tell me what is being measured. Individual type measure. Oh, here it is. This is what's being measured. So a link to this measure. So let's go back to that list of artifacts. Nope. Maybe there's some list of examples. 130. Here's going to be our measure. So that's the colorectal cancer measure, demonstrating the use of the framework percentage of adults who had appropriate screening for cancer. Okay, so 0% of this 1 person had appropriate screening. Now we're on to the next measure, which is probably going to have a similar structure. Why does it have an improvement notation of increase? How did it increase at 0? Couldn't have been negative before. Okay, this one has a numerator of, again, 0, a denominator of 1, a score of zilch. So again, I guess we're saying this person didn't have something. It's probably going to be cervical cancer. Let's just see, that was measure 124. So if we look at 124, yeah, that's cervical cancer measure. All right, so those are the two measures. It's a lot of text to say, did not get screened for cervical cancer. Okay. Now we get into these detected issues. Keep scrolling down. All right, detected issue number 1. There was a gap in care detected. That tells us the category. This is who it's about. It's about our favorite patient here. And there's some evidence, which is the report that we just looked at, is the evidence that there is this detected issue. Okay, so the fact that they weren't screened is a measure report. From that measure report, we can determine that there was a gap. All right, and then we're going to do a similar deal here. There was a gap. Okay. Now what tells us if this is a closed gap or an open gap? Oh, look at this. We've got 2 bundles in this parameter's result. They're showing us an example with gaps open and an example with gaps closed. Now, I wonder if this is just sort of an artifact of testing or whether that's actually a valid thing to do, to put all these different bundles in one gaps response. What is the cardinality of output? 0 to star. So there can be multiple bundles. Okay, so on to the second bundle. Here we've got another composition, which is a gaps in care report. I'm just going to check to see if it's about the same patient or a different patient. No, so they're about 2 different patients, which is kind of odd, but I can ask for only one subject. I really don't know what the input parameters would have been. All right, so let's look at what we've got here. These are going to be our closed gaps. So again, we've got these proportional measures. We've got an initial population of 0, numerator of 1, a denominator of 1. Now we've got a measure score of 1.0. 100% of this one person was screened for colorectal cancer, presumably. And then I guess we're going to find the same thing down here, that 100% of this same one person was screened for cervical cancer. No, I jumped too far. So here, there aren't going to be any detected issues. I guess that's the thing. So we just say 100% were screened. We say here's an encounter, presumably, at which the screening happened. The procedure was done at this encounter, which was a colonoscopy. How lovely. And now the patient resource is an Asian, Hispanic person who's male, whose name is Ludwig, family name Thomas Ludwig. All right. The organization taking care of them. Okay, so in this case, we don't get any detected issues. We just get the measure report showing how well that person was doing. All right, so we learn a lot from an example like this because it sort of takes us on a tour of a lot of the different aspects of the profile, figure out what's going on here. At least I feel kind of oriented now. I'll spend maybe 5 more minutes now taking a look at some of these more specific content profiles to see if we can make sense of them now that we know how the example works. So first there's the bundle. This is sort of the thing that wraps up one composition and report about some population. Let's see, this is building on an underlying bundle defined in DEQM, maybe. Mandatory data elements. There has to be a bundle type of document, great, and there has to be a composition, and then they should have measure reports for all the things the composition talks about. So in terms of the actual underlying profiling mechanics here, fixed value of document, there's got to be one or more entries of which exactly one is a composition. And for that, it fits this gaps in care composition profile. So we'll open that one up. And then after that, there can be some gaps in care measures. So what do we know about the composition? It's got to have QI core patient, a date that it was created, a title. This is interesting. Why do I only need to know the date that the report was created? Don't I need to know the set of dates over which it was evaluated? I guess that's going to be pushed a little bit farther down, maybe not at the level of the composition, but at the level of the measure reports or detected issues. Let's see, when are we going to find the start as well as the end dates? So this one has a period. It needs to have a start and an end. That's here in the measurement period. I guess the idea is you could have a bunch of different measurement reports, all from different periods, rolled up into a single composition. That's why the composition itself doesn't have a reporting period. Well, I think the composition should have a reporting period, given that it's generated in response to a specific request. Okay, so the only thing that's really been added here is the gaps through period. Note that in a gaps in care report, it uses the gaps through period instead of the measurement period. Whoa. So it's new content. Where does it show up? I'm having trouble understanding where this is written. I mean, other than right here. Who else talks about gaps through period? I don't know where that's defined. There's this period here, but I think we just explicitly saw that it's not the same as the gaps through period. So I can't quite tell what's happening there. This one here has a detected issue hard-coded to care gap and references the measure the detected issue applies to. Guess that's evidence. So we're going to have at least one piece of supporting evidence, and each piece of supporting evidence needs to have a detail, which is a reference back to one of these things. So the hard part about this is all of these profiles need to refer to data that has been appropriately profiled according to this quality measures system, whether it's patients or organizations or encounters or procedures. It's a whole sort of sub-world that has its own data profiling requirements associated. It makes it very difficult to adopt sort of pieces of this without taking on the whole project together. And that's kind of difficult high-level feedback to give, but like the whole thing, even though the overall design seems to accomplish quite a bit, really requires a tremendous amount of very deep assumptions built into the infrastructure to support it. That's, honestly what worries me about adoption for this kind of spec. But I think I'm going to wrap it there and write this out to a DaVinci DEQM ballot feedback file. With that, I'm going to sign off.